Hey guys, this is Vince at Practical Performance. In this video, I'll be talking about the VinceBar with the corresponding front gusset cups, what they are, how they work, and briefly how they're installed. As you might know, they are installed inside the car, so it might be strange viewing the underside of our E46 platform and viewing it upside down. The reason for this is my workbench. It's the rear end of a 320, a sedan, and I have it sitting on a pallet on wheels so I can pull it in and out of the garage when I'm working on it. I use this for development and forming VIN skins and stuff like that. Today I'm going to use it to show you the stuff I'm talking about. And the reason we're viewing the underside is I want to start talking about what forces are applied and why we see the cracks, why the VinceBar and these repairs are needed in the first place. I'm used to viewing it from this view upside down. You're probably not. You're probably more used to viewing your car from underneath, the other way around. So let me spin the camera. So first of all, this is a subframe. This is an empty subframe without the diff. It doesn't have the control arms, which usually sit here, connected to the wheel and the drive axle and stuff like that. The subframe doesn't crack, first of all. That's completely incorrect. The subframe is very, very rigid. The subframe is connected to the car into what's called the rear axle carrier panel. This is the panel here. The underside, the floor of the car, if you will, this cracks. So the rear axle carrier panel, or the RACP, that cracks. So we have that out of the way, first of all. The reason it does that is the subframe, because of the diff and the torque and everything going on, is pulling hard onto it, okay? So the wheel is spinning like that when you accelerate it. It's kicking dirt that way. So the drive axle, the rear axle is spinning this way. And because of that, and because of Newton's laws and stuff, the diff sort of wants to go the other way. So because it's doing that, it's actually pulling the subframe, it's twisting the subframe like that, away from the car on the rear end, and it's pushing the front mounts into the chassis, if you will. So it's creating a rocking motion. Every time you accelerate, it's kind of going like this, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if you can see that, but sort of accelerate, get off, or brake, accelerate, and so on and so forth. So that's the rear axle. Then you have the drive shaft, or the prop shaft, if you will, that's carrying the torque from the engine and the gearbox into the diff like that. In a similar fashion, it creates a rocking motion sideways, like this. Let's see if that makes, there you go. So it moves it like that. The combined kind of motion is something that would probably look more like this. So it's rocking back and forth in slightly diagonal fashion, like that. So you probably also know that it's the left rear mount over here and the front right mount over here that are most prone to damage. They are the ones that crack first. I believe that's because of the diagonal sort of rocking motion. And you might say it actually doesn't rock like that. No way, it's connected, it's bolted to the car, but yes, it actually does, slightly at least. As you probably know, this again is the right front mount. This is the factory stud that goes in like this. It's screwed in, and because it's a bottom hole, this is the only way to attach it. This sort of hex piece is needed there. This is where you put a 30mm wrench and you sort of torque it in to sit there. And the subframe carries this. This is a factory bushing. It sits pressed into there like that, and it's actually the friction between the subframe and the bushing that basically moves the force from the rear axle into the body. Anyway, these two lips kind of sit onto the rear axle carrier panel. I made some marks there from the other video. But for the most part, it actually sits on top. Let's see if I can do this with one hand. The bushing comes in like that. It sits on top of there, and it rests on the hex piece there. So the subframe is pushing on the bushing, which is again pushing on the bolt that goes into the subframe like that. Okay, so that's kind of a solid connection, you'd say. Yes, but again, this is the piece, the inner sleeve here, the aluminum piece, that's kind of connected firmly to the body. Then there's rubber in between, and then there's the subframe and all that stuff. So there's some movement going on here that allows for the rocking motion back and forth. And those two lips there, they will be sort of pounding up and down like this. So the jerkier you drive your car, the more of this you can have. Like if you're on and off constantly on your throttle, you're gonna break your subframe, like many people say, or actually rear carrier panel, a lot sooner than if you're smoothly apply the throttle and you're not, constantly on and off. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit of that. We have, this is again the standard, the factory stud. The extended stud that comes with the VinceBar kit looks like this. It's actually, yeah, it doesn't have that hex piece to start with. We don't really need that because we're gonna be drilling through and threading through, and this is going to go all the way through and into the car. So, and we're going to connect it to the front gusset cup, and we're going to lock this in place with a jamming bolt on this side over here on the tip. These two nuts, a standard nut and the collar nut, I put there just to illustrate how you install this. It's kind of a mixed explanation of the forces and stuff, and mixed up with the installation. I don't know if this makes sense, but hopefully it does. When you install it, you jam these two nuts together. You screw it in, and you screw it in until you get a distance of about 90 millimeters from the top end here, or the bottom end here to the rear axle panel. That would correspond to this length here. That's about 90 millimeters. And because we have this hex piece on the original, and we know that the bushing sits against it, that's why we have this aluminum spacer, which is the same thickness here as the hex piece. Okay, so again, we have a compressing force pushing into the subframe. Sorry, I keep using that name, it's incorrect. The rear axle carrier panel on the front. I spoke briefly about it being a pulling motion at the rear here, and let's see, what do we want to talk about right now? Let's talk about the bushing design here as well. So on the rear end, we have this kind of setup. It's pressed into the subframe once again. And because it's pulling this way, there's not as much hammering going on. But in fact, the lips here again, the lips here again are hammering against. Let's see if I can spin that over and show you. Sits like that, sits like this. You can probably make out, there's a, let's use that. There's an arrow there, you see that? That's this arrow mark here, indicating front and rear direction of the bushing, and the lips are pushing there and there. So most of the force is actually being applied, hammering against this, up, downwards like this, okay? So the bolt is pulling to the chassis, to the mount that sits inside of this skin here. There's a threaded piece in there, just like there is in the front end. And this is again where we drill through, rather than have a bottom hole here and just have the skin to take the force. Actually, that's what I forgot. All this in the middle here, that's pretty flimsy, pretty thin sheet metal, single layer mostly, actually. The strong part of the car is what you usually call the chassis rail, or the chassis leg. That goes like this, kind of. It's the thicker material, it's pressed. This is where the spring sits. And we want to get the force here. This pulling force here and this pushing force here is actually applied to a rather, it's not a very strong part of the car, of the chassis. So you can see a diff here between where the chassis leg is and where this pulling force is applied. And there's a lever here actually, creating sort of a rocking motion like this as well, if you will, a torque. So this force here is applied to the rest of the chassis through this sheet metal here, these spot welds here. There's a couple of MIG welds. There's a few spot welds here underneath the seam sealer going in, and they're on the other top side as well. But there's not really a lot other than the sheet metal, the formed sheet metal here that moves the load path from the load into the chassis leg. That's what the VinceBar addresses on the inside, okay? And because of this, the rocking and the pulling and so on and so forth, this piece here, the pressed sheet metal, you can see that as sort of a beam, if you will. It's bent, it's being pulled down. It's being pulled down like this over and over and over and over again. And this is why the cracks apply in these corners where the sheet metal is pressed thin and there's a stress concentration. Okay, so the reason I was talking about how this was pulling and so on, it's not as important to support any pushing forces here as it is on the front side here. You'll typically see there's a lot of cracks and there's dents in because this is banging in like that. Which is actually one of the reasons I prefer solid bushings rather than the rubber ones, because you don't get that sort of, if you have something sitting still like that, there's less hammering going on, essentially. Okay, let's see, is that all for the underside? We have the holes. Yeah, I think so. No, actually, there's one more thing. We're on the right side of the car right now. This is where you have the gas filler, and there's the tank sitting over here. There's a couple of tubes going into the tank from the ventilation tubes, essentially, going into the chassis leg on the top side of the spring mount here, the spring seat. There's a metal tube here, obviously, as you can see, in which two plastic tubes go. You don't want to puncture those. And you can easily do so if you drill too deep when you're installing the VinceBar. I'm going to show you that in the next video. So stay tuned.